Wandile, you know, I was looking at some of the articles that you've written around that and the essays that have been written around this issue. And one thing that comes to mind is the issue of it's a lot to do with implementation as opposed to the policies itself. It almost appears as though the implementation aspect of it is really lacking.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been some of the good policies over the past on saying, look, how can land reform really be implemented in South Africa, which is exactly one of the first essays, for example, that we wrote with Professor Johan Kirsten of the BER. But obviously, some of those were never really followed through, which is why partly we find ourselves in this place today. And hopefully, the discussions that we're currently having will be able to lead us to a more fruitful outcome at the end of the day. But obviously, when you're looking on at some of the proposed policies, they're not largely desirable if you are to look at it from the economic lens, to say macroeconomic lens. Will some of these policies really give us what we want? We see a little bit of a promise on that end, which is why I think the discussion that we're having is useful, because now we can begin to think thoroughly to say what is it that we really need to do in order to see some bit of a good transformation in South Africa, because we haven't seen that in a large scale over the past.
And then you're also making a reference to the fact that we need to start looking at success stories, right? And which particular countries would you say we need to, if we're to adopt a successful model, or an effective model rather, of when it comes to land reform policies, where should we be looking for the answers?
No, I mean, look, one thing that you need to appreciate is the fact that some of the countries which have undergone through this process have done that due to different reasons than what you are finding in South Africa. And also, if you are to look at it largely from the agricultural side, the agroecological condition of those countries differ from South Africa, which is why I sometimes oppose when people bring on, say, look, let's take the Chinese or Asian models and bring it in South Africa, where we subdivide the farms into small. Those wouldn't really help us much. But I do think that you can take bits and bits at different countries. For example, in Rwanda, you can learn a little bit on what has been done in what was formerly a communal land. And even in our neighbors, look at Namibia, you can take some few lessons there around the first right of refusal, but obviously tailoring those things to fit on in the context of South Africa. But I think large part of what we need to do, we need to also look back in our current agricultural system, and also just land reform broadly, including the housing side, to say, what is it that we really planned in 1994? Did we really follow through all of those steps? If we didn't, what were some of the hindering steps? And as we go forward now, where do we need to change and tweak, and what instruments do we need to put in place to make sure that we achieve all of that which we desire, which I think the current work that is being done, partially, for example, on the land reform panel, which I sit on, it does look at those things, and hopefully by the end of the whole process, we'll be able to come up with some actionable plans which could lead South Africa to a better place.
Yeah, so the planning aspect of it, I think we both can agree, the fact that it's been effective in the sense that we're very good at tabling agendas and tabling policies as a South African context. But when we look at the larger discourse, and I'm going to make reference of something that you also make reference to in your essay, the proactive land acquisition strategy, for example, that was introduced in 2006. I mean, you're speaking about acquiring land, and I think about 2.3 hectares of land, million hectares that is, of land were acquired from government, or by government rather, for the purpose of land reform. And to date, when we're finding that, the issue here is the fact that that very same acquired land has not reached the hands of beneficiaries. So then somewhere, somehow, there is a break in communication in that regard.
No, I mean, look, it has somewhat reached the hands of the beneficiaries, but that has been done in a form of giving people leases, which to a certain extent are not tradable. And if they are not tradable, then it becomes difficult for people to really unlock some of the economic activities in those pieces of land. And all of that was done with the hope that there might be some follow-through support which could assist guys that are participating in those land parcels. But obviously that we've come to understand that now it hasn't been really effective.
Yeah.
So going forward,
I just wanted to take a second there, Wandile, and talk about these kinds of leases. I mean, we're talking about leases between 1 to 5 years. And I mean, one such an example that you are making use of, saying that how is it that you can actually have any form of sustainable farming where you've got a lease of 1 to 5 years to prove that your actual land is successful, or what you're doing is successful, because even collateral, the issues around collateral or seeking more funding opportunities, they become hampered as a result of even having a lease that is that short.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. Like I said, those leases were put in place with the hope that there will be follow-through government support in those farms, which didn't really happen. Now, going forward, what you need in those pieces of land is really to have some tradable form of leases. It can be the 30-year lease that government is currently talking about, but desirable, in my personal opinion, would have to grant people at least a 99-year lease, which is what globally you see happening in a number of countries.
Yeah.
So hopefully if we can achieve that, we might be able to unlock economic activity in those areas.
Then at the center of this entire argument, and I know that election year is coming up, and you can imagine how many political entities will be making reference to this. I mean, you're mentioning in one of the articles that the EFF strategy, for example, will destroy the asset value of large portions of South Africa's land. Let's talk to us about that.
No, I mean, look, that is based on a view. If you were to nationalize all the land in South Africa, so given the amount of land that is already bonded and financial instruments on that, obviously you would have a lot of unintended consequences, which is what also I think it differs than what if you were to read, for example, the ANC's policy document, which they publish on their side, because they make reference on the areas of land which they want to expropriate, the underutilized, unused, and all of those parcels, while the EFF, at least in my understanding, it seems to be speaking about all land in South Africa, and I don't think that would be a desirable route for South Africa.
Yeah, and then also another issue here is the belief or the assumption that if we go through with land reform policies or expropriation without compensation, it is to the detriment of another portion of South Africa's population. In other words, we cannot address the injustices of the past around land if we do not make sure, or if we do not have another group of people who are not benefiting from such conversations and not benefiting from such discussions. So in other words, no positive returns for both parties.
No, I don't think that it is land reform is naturally a zero-sum game. I mean, many people, even those who are commercial farmers, they do support land reform, that it should happen. Where the disagreements come about is on the implementation of that, to say how do we go about really rolling the land reform, which is where now you find the expropriation without compensation, some people talking about joint venture approaches. And I think if we can find a middle ground, because at the end of the day, look, this is two ways. You have a restorative justice conversation, but at the same time, you have to make sure that whatever you do, it leads to the improvement in living standards of many South Africans. So you can use land reform as unlocking growth in the agricultural sector and job creation, but at the same time, this should not be reduced only to agriculture. It is also about the human settlement in the urban areas, and there's a lot that we can do there. I don't think that land reform is a zero-sum game. I think that everyone could benefit on it, but depending on what approach as a country we get to take going forward.
Definitely an ongoing conversation. Thanks a lot there for joining us, Wandile, this evening, giving us some insights in terms of exactly how do we start effectively tackling issues around land reform, and how is it that we can sort of dispel the myths and the narratives that are around the public, around land, conversations that will still persist. As you can imagine, 2019 is just around the corner.